I've never been very sensitive to ghost stories or supernatural things. I always thought it was all exaggeration or a way of coping with irrational fears. But after what happened, I don't think I'll ever look at my apartment the same way again. I moved into an old building right in the city center during my freshman year of college. The structure was old, with narrow hallways and a staircase that creaked with every step. It was the kind of place that seemed to have a million stories, but I always ignored that feeling. The rent was cheap, and I was away from my parents' house for the first time, so I was more excited about the idea of having my own space than about anything that might be strange. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The building was quiet at night, except for the typical children of an old building, a few here and there. But soon, I noticed something strange. At 3 a.m. every night, slow, heavy footsteps would start to appear in the hallway. It seemed to be coming from a nearby apartment, but I didn't mind it too much. Every now and then, you meet people who have different schedules, don't you? I just ignored it and tried to sleep. After a few weeks, the footsteps became a routine. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway, always at the exact same time, 3 a.m. I would turn to the side and try to ignore them, especially since the building was old and strange noises were common. The problem was that the footsteps wouldn't stop. They would come and go as if someone was walking back and forth very slowly, always at the same pace. I couldn't ignore them anymore. I thought about knocking on the neighbor's door, but the building was full of strange people, and I didn't want to seem crazy. It was one particularly hot summer night when there was no air conditioning that I noticed something that made me break out in a cold sweat. When the footsteps started, I kept my eyes open, listening, but this time, something was wrong. The direction of the sound had changed. It was no longer coming from the hallway. It came from my room. I lay paralyzed in bed, staring at the living room door, and the sound of footsteps seemed to get closer. Suddenly, I clearly heard the sound of someone stepping on the carpet in my living room. I was alone. There was no one there. I knew that. But the footsteps continued, starting to move around the apartment as if they were exploring the place. That's when I realized how desperate it was not to know where they were coming from. And worst of all, the feeling that with each step, the presence was getting closer to me. I was shaking, my body almost unable to move. But finally, I gathered my courage and stood up. The sound of footsteps continued, and my mind told me to go to the door and get out of there. I tried, but as soon as I walked towards the room, the footsteps suddenly stopped. Froze in place, waiting for something to happen, but the silence was even more terrifying. When I looked towards the corner of the room, a shadow slowly began to form, but I couldn't see it clearly. It looked human, but also strange, something that shouldn't be there. My breathing became muffled. The shadow in the corner of the room seemed to grow larger by the second, stretching as if it had a life of its own. I knew it wasn't my imagination. It couldn't be. That thing was there, right in front of me, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, but I couldn't react. I stood there, paralyzed, watching, waiting for something to happen, for the shadow to move, or for me to somehow find a rational explanation, but there was no explanation. When I finally gathered the courage to take a step toward the room, the shadow disappeared, as if it had been swallowed by the darkness. But the sound of the footsteps didn't stop. Now they were coming straight toward me, faster, heavier, as if the thing was running to catch up with me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. Then, as if my mind had given an automatic order to my body, I ran to the exit door and threw it open, stepping out into the hallway of the building. The hallway was silent, as empty as ever, but an uneasy feeling immediately overcame me. I couldn't stay there any longer. I ran to the stairs and quickly went down, trying not to look back. The sound of footsteps was no longer audible, but the feeling of being followed never stopped haunting me. I knew I shouldn't go back to that apartment, but I also knew I couldn't just leave things like that. I made it to the street, but even there in the cool night air, the feeling that something was watching me persisted. Every movement I made, every shadow that fell on the walls seemed to reinforce the feeling that I wasn't alone. That thing was with me, wherever I went. I couldn't sleep peacefully anymore. The footsteps still echoed in my mind. At that moment, I knew that the apartment wasn't just an old, creaky place. Something was there, something that had no explanation. I never went back to the building, and even now, as I share this, the feeling that I was still being watched has never left me. I left everything behind. The apartment, the city, everything. But the feeling that that being is still following me, that feeling will haunt me forever. I stood there in the hallway of the building, breathing heavily, but something told me not to stop. I looked back one last time, and as I did so, I almost fell backwards in fright. At the end of the hallway, where there had been nothing before, a dark shadow seemed to be moving slowly, as if it were watching me. I couldn't clearly see what it was, but the human shape and the way the shadow moved left no doubt that something was there, just waiting for me to go back inside the building. I walked away slowly, my feet feeling like they weighed tons. Fear was already taking over every muscle in my body, as if I was being controlled by something beyond my reach. I couldn't think straight. I just knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't stop looking at that spot in the hallway. It was as if the shadow was calling me, pulling my attention, drawing me back. For a moment, silence took over. The sound of my own footsteps was all I could hear, and even that sound seemed muffled, as if the hallway was consuming everything around it. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe it was just a reflection, the light, or a trick of the mind, but as I thought that, the sound came back. Footsteps, slowly, heavily, but this time they weren't coming from the hallway, they were coming from the stairs. I froze. The stairs were right next door, but there was no one there. The sound of heavy footsteps going up one after the other echoed down the stairs. Each step sounded louder than the last, until it seemed like someone was coming towards me. The feeling of being watched grew even more intense. I couldn't stay there any longer. The idea of going back to that apartment now seemed like suicide. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out at any moment. With shaking hands, I started running for the stairs. When I reached the door, my finger touched the doorknob. Before I could open it, a muffled scream echoed from somewhere upstairs. It was as if someone had been caught off guard, but the sound was distorted, almost unearthly. I froze. The scream lasted a few more seconds and then turned into a whisper. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where that sound was coming from. I was at the limit of my fear, the fear of not knowing what was happening, of not understanding what was there. I looked at the door that separated me from the street, and as a reflex, I quickly opened it. The moment I took the first step outside, the footsteps stopped abruptly. A deafening silence took over everything. It was as if the city itself had disappeared. The feeling of being watched had never been so strong. As if something had approached me, moving in the same direction as me, waiting for an opportunity to reach me. I looked around but saw nothing. The building was immersed in darkness, and the street was empty. As if the world had been left behind, every step I took away from the building seemed to be towards something even more unknown. Something was following me. I felt it with every fiber of my body. Fear was taking over me, but I knew I couldn't stop running. I looked back one last time. I don't know what I expected to find, but what I saw, or rather what I felt, was enough to make me understand that that night, I would never truly be alone. My breath was coming in short pants, but I kept walking quickly, trying to control the panic that was consuming me. The street was deserted, but at the same time, it didn't seem to be enough to give me a sense of safety. Every shadow, every reflection in the shop windows made me stop and look carefully, as if I could see someone watching me. The sound of my footsteps on the sidewalk seemed to mix with the footsteps that still echoed in my head, as if the thing chasing me was always one step behind. When I was about to reach the end of the street, a feeling of intense cold took over me. It wasn't ordinary cold. It was something deep, icy, that momentarily paralyzed me, and then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. It wasn't coming from the building. It wasn't coming from the streets. It was coming from inside me. I stopped in the middle of the street, feeling the weight of the feeling that dragged me along. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone, even though I had run out of the building. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I could feel the presence behind me like a shadow, something that moved silently, waiting for the right moment to get closer. I looked around, searching for any sign of life, but the street was empty. There were no cars passing by, no other pedestrians. Only the long, distorted shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Everything seemed still, but at the same time, fear was overwhelming me. I didn't know if I should move forward or go back to the building. The streetlights flickered strangely, and the wind seemed to whisper words I couldn't understand. The feeling that something was behind me only grew stronger. I glanced back quickly, but the street was empty, as if it had been left behind, just like me. But when I looked back ahead, my heart almost stopped. The building was there, at the end of the street, but something was different. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched. It was as if the building itself had changed, as if it had stretched out, taller and more menacing, like an open mouth, waiting for me. That feeling that I wasn't alone, but at the same time I couldn't see who or what was there, was consuming me. Every step I took on the street seemed to echo louder in my head. The sound of my own heart beating seemed deafening, as if it were the only sound in the world. But it wasn't. There was something else, something that was following me, something that knew where I was no matter where I went. Suddenly the wind picked up like an icy gust that made me shiver. I flinched and looked around. The building seemed to have stretched out once more, as if it were reaching out, leaning in to reach me. And it was in that moment, in that exact second, that I saw it. The figure. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a shadow, it was a presence, a figure indistinct but still extremely present. It was standing in the window of the building, looking down at me. I couldn't see the details, but I knew it wasn't something I was supposed to see. This thing was watching me, waiting to get me. I froze, paralyzed by fear, but before I could move, she was gone. There was nothing left in the window. What happened next was even stranger. I started walking back unwillingly, but I could no longer control my own steps. I knew I had to get out of there, but something was stopping me from running. The fear was so ingrained in me that my legs could barely carry me to the nearest street. When I finally reached the corner of the street, I stopped. The feeling that something was behind me had never been so strong. I looked back once more, and there it was. Not in the window, not in the building, but in my direction at the end of the street. A figure standing still motionless, watching me. I could no longer react. I was so stunned, so exhausted from fear that I could no longer distinguish what was real. What was happening? I will never forget that moment. I knew that somehow something was about to happen, something that I could not prevent. But then, as if time had stopped, everything went still. There were no more footsteps, no more figures. The silence was so deep that it seemed to swallow me. I looked at the building one last time, and then, suddenly, the door to my apartment opened. I didn't know how or why, but the door was open as if it were calling me back. But I never went back. I stood there, frozen in the street. The door to my apartment was still open, as if someone or something was calling me back. The wind that had come up moments before was now completely still. The silence was so oppressive that it seemed like I could hear my own blood pulsing through my veins. Every part of my body screamed for me to run away, but at the same time, there was an invisible force pulling me back. I knew I shouldn't go back, but the urge to go to that door was becoming stronger and stronger, as if it was the only thing I could do to end this. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't end. Just as I was about to close the door behind me, a shadow moved quickly, crossing the room. It wasn't a reflection, I was sure of that. The shadow moved with frightening speed, as if it were trying to prevent me from seeing it. But I saw it. I saw it for a second before it disappeared. I froze again, not knowing what to do. What was happening to me? Every time I tried to process what was happening, the more confused and desperate I became. I had to get out of there, but something was making me stay, something I couldn't understand. The shadow didn't come back. But suddenly the footsteps started again, only now they weren't coming from the direction of the door. They were coming from the hallway. Slow, heavy footsteps, as if they were crawling to reach me. The sound got closer and closer, and suddenly the bedroom door closed by itself with a bang. I jumped, the fright paralyzing me. I knew that no one else was there. I was alone. Or so I thought. My eyes fixed on the hallway where the sound of footsteps seemed to multiply as if several people were approaching. I couldn't see who was there, but the sound was very close, almost inside my own body. Each footstep echoed in my head. Each sound seemed to be pushing me towards madness. I didn't know if I should scream, run, or simply fall to the ground. Fear was taking over me, and the feeling of being completely alone, but at the same time being chased, was unbearable. I couldn't understand it, but I knew something was there for sure. Something was watching me. Something was surrounding me. But why? The footsteps were so close now that I could feel the air move with each one of them. I looked at the room and suddenly the door slowly opened. It wasn't like someone had pushed it. It simply started to open on its own, as if an invisible hand was moving it. I couldn't resist any longer. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway, past the open door, and not looking back. Each step seemed heavier than the last, but the sound of the footsteps behind me continued, closer, louder, as if they were reaching me with every second. I just wanted to get out of that place, but the feeling that I couldn't escape consumed me more and more. I don't know how I managed to get to the door. I just knew that I had to get out. When I finally managed to open the apartment door and step out onto the street, the relief was immediate, but the fear didn't go away. I still felt like something was watching me, following me. I looked back one last time, but everything was silent. But I knew that this wasn't over yet.